I'm going to be making a taper cut on this scrap piece of pine. So what I want to end up with is a piece of pine that goes from full to about an inch shorter on this side. And this is just a scrap to show. So let's get started. To make this jig, you need a scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood. It needs to be larger than the size of the wood that you're cutting, and it also needs to have square edges. You'll also need a few small scraps of 3/4 inch plywood that will be screwed down and will hold the piece of wood that you're cutting in place in the jig. You'll need 2 small toggle clamps. You'll also want some screws. Some 1 1/4 inch screws for this part. 1 1/4 will get it through this part and down here without going through to the other side and scraping up the table saw. And then for the toggle clamps, you just want some small little things like this. On the narrow end, I want the width to be about an inch, 1.5 inches shorter than the width of the top. So I made a mark on the pine and lined it up with the edge of the plywood. The top end is lined up flush to the edge of the plywood. Screw down some scraps of 3/4 inch plywood to keep the pine in place at the correct angle. The last thing we need to do before we cut it is to screw down some toggle clamps to keep the pine firmly in place when it's being cut. These need to be the same height as the wood we're cutting, so I'm going to screw down some 3/4 inch plywood to attach the toggle clamps to. When you're deciding on the placement of your toggle clamp, you're going to want to make sure that you don't go past this line because this is where the blade is going to be going. So you want to get it far enough that it's on the piece you're cutting without going so far that it's in the way of the blade. So I've set the width to be exactly the size of the plywood, and you can see as we run this through, it's going to give us a tapered cut on that piece of wood. I put together a similar jig to make angled cuts on 2x4 and 4x4 lumber, which I glued together to make this modern side table. If you need to cut thicker wood like I did for this side table, just be sure that the top of your 4x4 doesn't end up higher than the blade on your table saw. I ended up having to cut the bottom of my jig out and have an extra set of hands during the cutting process to make it work. I'd love to see what you make with your tapered cuts. Post a photo on Facebook or Instagram and be sure to tag House Becoming Home so I can take a look.